So basically how to move beyond constitutionalism. Of course, constitutionalism is extremely important. The Holy Trinity stays the Holy Trinity. I completely agree with that. But I think we've been colonized a bit by constitutional thinking, under the American influence actually, and we are stuck with it, I think. I think the constitutionalism serves as some kind of religion to lawyers, and we're just struggling to get out of this paradigm. And I think it's at our own peril, actually. I think this arrests our social imagination, and it prevents us from somehow fruitfully rethinking the European Union. So let me just explain a little bit my background, basically, so where I'm coming from, and what led me to these conclusions that I just threw, violently on the table. Basically, I am Slovenian by origin, so I come from the European periphery. I worked at the European Court of Justice. I was actually one of the first officials from the new countries after 2004 enlargement. And when I was struggling with constitutionalism and the power dynamics that I was actually viewing in my daily work, I saw there's a huge disconnect, basically. It's as if there's two different languages we're speaking. And then, of course, all the narratives that were written to me about the European Union were the narratives of the center, basically, or of the West, or of the stronger countries, and the stronger actors in the Union, and those from the periphery somehow sidelined from what's actually going on in the Union. And then, of course, then came the the Lavan Viking debate, and where I felt frustrated. There's all this debate about social rights, and let's have the social union. And I wrote, whose social union are we actually talking about? So is it the peripheral social union, the central social union? Whose? And then I kept struggling with constitutionalism. So basically, how do I articulate my frustration in the language of constitutionalism? And I mean, much as I engage with it, hugely, I realized that the Holy Trinity somehow doesn't help me out that much. I thought that the transformations of the European Union that we've been hearing have been transformations of the European constitutional structures, which in one way or the other actually contributed to the existing distribution of spiritual and material values in the European Union. So, and people from the periphery had equal rights. We all had, our judges and officials and commissioners and so forth, but still I thought there was some power dynamics there that just wasn't captured by the language that we academics are speaking. So I was actually worried that the constitutional debate contributed to the reproduction of the status quo. It failed to articulate the considerations of the periphery and other considerations, social considerations as well, not just of the periphery. And constitutionalism was all about ordering and polishing the existing order while allowing the dominant consciousness of the center to actually drive the daily dynamics of the Union. So all the constitutional changes to me have been sort of a storms in a teacup. So let's rethink constitutionally the EU very differently, and it's sort of a and I was really attuned to that, and let's do that. But somehow it's sort of it all came back to the reproduction of the status quo, at least for me. So so some of the struggles was my struggles were that constitutionalism actually obscures power relationships. And so just think about it. Let's say Brussels is considered as the center, and then the national institutions as the periphery, or vice versa. This blurs the power relationships of the Union completely, although this is one of the prime constitutional debates, right? The power is not in Athens or in Ljubljana, where I come from, right? The power is totally elsewhere, and we lawyers fail to articulate that power. So when I was grasping this irrationality of constitutionalism, of the system of the EU, I was struggling with how to rationalize this irrationality that is the European Union differently, that would actually help me to articulate my frustrations. And then the problem, of course, is then that once one sets aside coherence, the rational structure of the Union, the problem is how do I deal with that, right? Do I go into left and right politics, which to me wasn't enough? Because I thought the left and right of the periphery is something different from the left and right of the center. I struggled with, sort of do we just speak about competing narratives, sort of the cover idea? So, but that to me was not analytically robust. So, so how do we speak about the irrational, basically, in the European Union? How could we reshape our discourse, or rethink our discourse and restructure it in an analytically robust manner? So how do we bring power in, right? And power is very difficult to theorize because, Foucault says power is everywhere, so what do you do with that, right? How do you grasp it then? So the analytical structure that I set up for myself, actually, that helped me articulate what center and periphery actually is in the European Union. So, center, the sort of richer regions, the periphery, the poor regions, and that's a very basic understanding of the center-periphery relationship that is not helpful to legal analysis. So I came to the conclusion that if we want to locate power, and that we want to integrate power into legal analysis, actually what I thought was that you cannot, that Dworkin and Hart are not helpful anymore once you've been disillusioned to the extent I have been, although Matthias thinks that one can use principles and one right answer and critical analysis nonetheless, but we can talk about that later. I thought power needs to be brought into the analysis, and I thought the existing theorizations of the very idea of law don't bring it in. So what I thought was, so basically the analytical structure I constructed was to focus on the hierarchical structure of production, of material and spiritual value. So the hierarchical structure of production of goods, services, the academic production of spiritual values, of dreams, you name it. So so what is this? So how does this analytical picture work, basically? The idea is that each of us is set in a very particular hierarchical position every moment in time. And let's say, there are hierarchies in this room, there are hierarchies in this university, in Copenhagen, in Denmark, in Europe, in globalized hierarchies. And we're actually connected with people everywhere in a particular hierarchical situation every moment in time. And here I actually, in order to see how we actually play with these hierarchies, how we play with power, I combined Hegel, Cover, and Hofeld to argue that the lowest common denominator of the legal system is injury. So it's a privilege to harm. So, we've been obsessed with giving people rights and freedoms and, and voice and so forth. But what I'm putting on the table is let's articulate how people are harmed, right? So because depending on where you are in a hierarchical structure of society, you can harm other people radically different, right? So, and in my work, I showed how the center has much more privileges to harm the periphery than vice versa, basically. So yesterday, Cover was mentioned, and Cover did say that legal interpretation takes place in the field of pain and death, right? So I'm saying, or if you see how the hierarchy functions according to Hegel, basically, it's a constant master-slave dialectics, right? We keep injuring other people when we constitute our individuality, and it's sort of it's a constant thing going on, right? So we need to play with these injuries, and Hofeld basically said, one of the lowest common denominators of the legal system is a privilege to harm, right? And I'm playing with that. I'm saying the only lowest common denominator of the legal system is a privilege to harm, but that's a deeper debate maybe we can come to another time. So what are the elements of this construction, basically? So my work is basically attuned to your fourth typology, right? Of how do we of the irrational, right? But of course I've been struggling as to how to rationalize this irrational. And in terms of time, there's no foundation, basically. There's no, it's really the past, present, and the future are in a constant interrelationship, right? The hierarchies are in a constant state of becoming, and we need to keep articulating them in order to reshape society. So this discourse is not about more or less Europe, but more or less sovereignty, more representation, more rights. It's really about something else, right? It's about a constant hierarchical struggle. So, I've been saying that, if we set constitutionalism aside or, forget the liberal theory, it's not that, or if we bracket constitutionalism, it's not that war's coming back. We just have to acknowledge the struggle has been there before liberal institutions, and the hierarchical struggle is continuing after the liberal institutions were set up. It's just ordered a little bit differently, right? So ideology in this idea of law is that the ideology is the memory of past injuries and hierarchies. It's actually our synthesized past experience. So it's this legal framework that actually allowed me to articulate what is center, what is the periphery, because this structure helps you to zoom in and zoom out, basically, from really micro hierarchies, the daily hierarchies we see, and sort of a macro hierarchies of the center-periphery relationships. And I think this is the actual sort of potential of emancipation in the European Union, right? So a shift from not how we are free or, you know, of what kind of rights we are, but how are we injured. And this is the vehicle, the injury, as the lowest common denominator of the legal system, is actually a vehicle of legal theory, so to say, of, you know, how to bring all these competing narratives to the fore. So, you know, this goes quite beyond of the critique of the EU in terms of capitalism, for example, right? It's not that, you know, we should sort of we should substitute one big theory with another big theory in order to be critical. No, it's yeah. Thank you so much. So I'm actually stopping here. Basically it's analysis in legal theory of how to actually portray domination and how to emancipate people in a quite a different way, I think, than what, you know, we've inherited intellectually, and I think hinders our social imagination. Okay, I think I'll stop here.
Sure. Do you want me to start, or did you collect?
Yeah, but you start.
Okay, so thank you, Damjan. And I was wondering, what is the non-hierarchical structure you have in mind? And to this day, I still assign your Who's Europe to my students to see the other side of the Viking-Laval debate, which I love. But it turns out that in the work that we've been doing with Antoine and Michael on micro-narratives of European integration, it's very hard to find the position that you describe in Who's Social Europe, because kind of the Eastern pro-workers mobility position, it's kind of fragmented. There's not so many documents and so much documentation of the position that you are depicting. It's not really out there as a position. You might find something sketched in some commissioners from Eastern Europe, but there is not the kind of trade union movement that you see on the Western side. Yeah.
So the question is?
The question is to come up to your Who's Europe position, Who's Social Europe. I think there hasn't been, except from you, I haven't seen a coalition of voices to make your point that you're making about the hierarchy. Why is that?
Mm-hmm.
You're not allowed to answer yet.
Okay, good.
And I remind everyone, when you ask questions, Lance and you on the same. Sasha first.
Okay, I have two really short questions. The first is, are you thinking, when you talk about emancipation, are you thinking about moving from some emancipation that affects society to a whole to small scale of emancipations for distinct groups? This would be the Ernesto Laclau move, from one emancipation to small emancipations. So this is the idea. And the second question is, but it's a larger question that we cannot, I think, discuss here, but master-slave dialectic. Isn't this a problem that arises whenever we are confronted with court opinions? If we have to make sense of court opinions in order to speak the language of courts when we appear before a court, we are immediately intellectually put in the position of a slave, because we have to take the premises of the master, the court, for granted. Yeah? There's something deeply humiliating and enslaving about legal scholarship, I think. So is this your idea, or what is it?
Okay.
Thank you. Matthias.
Okay, thanks a lot, and I completely agree that we have to focus on power. Yet when you say power, you mean hierarchy, and you establish this false dichotomy of domination, emancipation, as if emancipation was somehow liberation from power. But isn't the problem of power in European Union and elsewhere much more difficult, because it's not just political, it's not just legal power of the court, it's a societal power running through private and public domain. It's a power of technology. It's simply potentialities which European Union has to handle, constrain, regulate, but in the end, its power is always beyond regulation. Yeah, but a regulated power is already some form of potestas. Yeah, it's not potential, but what we are threatened by is potentialities of the market, negative, positive, of the technologies, and so on.
And then
Okay.
Jan?
Yeah, so what you presented was a critical project, so what is your positive project, if any?
A question that kills critical legal studies. This
Yes.
Oh, and Calypso.
Yeah, I mean, all the fantastic points, and I was just wondering. I mean, yes, to Yuri, that part of what we're talking about is not power over, but power to, and rechanneling opportunities, and how do we do that? And Damjan, you're kind of talking about do no harm, right? I mean, when you talk about injury and hierarchy, it's the power to harm others. And, that's a fundamental principle of, I mean, it could be, and I've said that, and then the others, that if only the EU could just and simply commit to doing no harm to its member states, to its citizens. It's simple but very, very difficult, but it's one way of translating, I think, what you're saying. But then the question for you, but also for the whole project and for Jan really, is how do we systematically ask whether something which is an ethos to be translated into a praxis and vice versa needs to be constitutionalized, or rather whether and to what extent your dominant thinking in terms of constitutionalization may do harm to principles that might guide us. Because after all, we all know that constitutions are a way for the dead to tie the hands of the living, and that if part of what we're saying is that in this world of crazy new technology, emancipation must always emancipate itself from previous models of emancipation. It's kind of like the recursive stuff. So maybe we are in a world beyond constitutions. Or maybe constitutions should be websites that can be crowdsourced and hyperlinked and changed in various kind of innovative ways. So can we liberate ourselves from constitutional thinking and yet draw on all the fascinating stuff we've said about constitutional imagination?
Thank you. Then back to you. Response.
Yeah? Okay. Yeah, there's another question there?
Oh, there's one more. Question,
Yes,
please.
let me out very short. Two quotations simply. One is from Wolfgang Streeck, where he says we should look, I cited, we would call the acquis démocratique of the national demo in Europe importantly comprises a wide range of political economic institutions that provide for democratic corrections of market outcomes, for democracy as social democracy. Now, if you create this right to harm, I refer to your earlier articles also, you must destroy these kind of accomplishments, and you must say they are not legitimate, whereas I would say they are legitimate. And the lack we have, or the point where I think your work should consider whether the design failure of Europe is that we say you follow our model, but we don't give you a chance, or we don't give you a Marshall Plan, we give you a acquis communautaire, to make it very brief.
Just to clarify, what is the accomplishment that you think I'm destroying?
Well, what I think is happening in our integration project, which I also explained, is that we, of course, by exercises, take Germany, Italy, take the asymmetries we have created after monetary union. This is deeply problematic, right? Now, here I can say, well, how would you solve it? But in your case, when it comes to the right, or the social rights of East European workers, there I would say the problem is that in the construction or the integration project, there was a deep failure in not seeing to it how these societies could develop into something which they themselves establish as their democratic and social active, and were immediately exposed to certain types of competition. And then, of course, it looks like a way of protecting that you say, no, then I have the right to enter your market and this kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'll go from the start. So basically, yes, Fernanda, you say, there's no sort of movement or trade union. But it is arising, actually, I have to tell you. So basically, funnily, I'm often invited to Poland to speak because they're just are trying to cling to something, Of course, Poland is now an outcast, like Hungary, so all the, so it's...
Everyone.
So not everyone, exactly.
So that's what you teach us,
But
right?
yeah, exactly. So, there is a kind of a movement, but the problem is, of course, it's the whole reproduction of the hierarchy reproducing itself. That the periphery does not have the intellectual organization that the center has. I mean, look here, we're a couple of us from the periphery, right? We all teach in the center, right?
You mean
so?
Wales?
Well, you're the periphery of the center, but center nonetheless. So, basically, that's the problem. It's a constant problem, right? So, the periphery just doesn't have the means, the intellectual, not the capacity, but let's say the academic capacity, let's say, right? So, and the whole problem is now in the new Posted Workers Directive was adopted, right? I spoke in the European Parliament about it. Again, the Poles invited me. Could you please say this is not a good thing? But it all boiled down again to more social Europe, more social Europe, more social Europe. How do you argue that? I mean, and so I don't think I'm destroying anything along the way, I'm just trying to say, yes, of course, I'm all for the rights of workers, absolutely, It's just that let's bring these tensions of injury to the fore that we're just, ignoring. So let's hope that more develops, and there are things in the making, I have to tell you. So also in terms of my work, which is forthcoming. Okay, then is it small scale, large scale emancipation? Basically, it's both. So what I'm doing here is, it's not just, and here it's not just a critical project in the sense of trashing, sort of like, this is not good, No, I'm reconstituting, so I'm trying to give a new language of how to speak, of how to rethink the European Union that moves beyond the constitutional analysis, that sort of integrates the critiques of there is no coherence, there is irrationality, how do we deal with that, right? And this, so this analytical framework that I'm putting on the table is useful for any sort of emancipation, for small scale or for large scale. This particular center periphery project is basically it's just my passion and interest, basically, that I have, right? So this is my sort of a more normative project, a political project. But the essential that I find even more intellectually stimulating is my intellectual project of how we would need to speak no matter where in the world we would like to speak about emancipation. So I believe my framework that I'm putting on the table is useful for someone in Indonesia who's just unhappy about God knows what, right? So hierarchies are everywhere, right? They're reproducing themselves, and they need to be articulated every time anew. As to the master-slave dialectics, I'm not sure we're really slaves in the face of the ECJ. I pleaded several cases before the ECJ, and when I was, a young lawyer, I was really scared of the judges, I have to tell you, when I came pleading. But then in the end, I realized that they know, they're human. They know relatively little about what I'm actually telling them, So I need to make it very simple. I need to make it very simple so they understand my point, and also academically, I think academics are much more influential than we would like to think. Oh yes, the lawyers read us, the referendairs read us, and so forth. There's lots of influence going there. So I think there's a constant master-slave dialectics that cannot be reduced to a slave, never, ever, right? So, okay. So power, how do you regulate power? So I don't really agree with the idea that power is beyond regulation. I don't think so. I think that by regulating, we contribute to power one way or the other. We contribute to distribution of power, right? And I think this is the lawyer's problem, because we think we're somehow outside of power. No, we're not. We're really powerful. That's what I'm saying, right? We're powerful in many ways. We're articulating the vocabulary with which we would like to transform the union. We have our own consciousness that we're putting on the table, right? I still think it's generally the consciousness of the center, but it's a problem actually. But we're very powerful. We're very powerful. So And I think the master-slave dialectics is, to me, the most useful way of speaking about power in terms of legal theory. But of course, that can be debated later. Okay. Again, is it a critical project, positive? So I'm not really sure what you mean by positive, more normative, or although I may have answered that question already. As I said, I have more of this, normative project in terms of center periphery, just out of my interest, but the key is the intellectual, basically, the legal theory project. It's a project of reconstruction. It's not just thrashing, as I said before. It's not just everything's irrational. Let's just speak politics. Law is politics. No, that's not what. It's not even intellectually interesting to speak that way, right? We need to find new, robust analytical frameworks to discuss our legal and social life. Okay, so then about harm. So I think Kalisa was you about speaking about let's not harm. So I think I wasn't clear on that point. So what do I mean by harm? Actually, I think that this master-slave dialectics is going on in every moment in time. Basically, it's going on now and now and now and now. It's never ending, right? So we are injuring ourselves in a way because we always have a choice, right? By what we're doing. Let's say I have a choice. Either I talk to you now, which is wonderful, but then my family is waiting for me somewhere outside, and my kids will grow up, and you always have a choice. You're always injured by your choice. You see what I mean? So injury is the lowest common denominator of our lives. It's like an existentialist argument. You cannot get out of the injury, you see? Now the problem is that we need to articulate the specific injuries that we impose on one another, and there's huge intellectual work to be done here, right? So what kind of injury do I impose on a guy in Bangladesh, probably, or I don't know where he won't wear his suit, right? So there's lots and lots of work for lawyers. And it's really the injury is the lowest common denominator, but then we need to, so it's like a long parole distinction, right? Long is the deep structure, and I'm saying injury is the deep structure, right? But then we need to articulate the parole all the time and challenge the parole we disagree with, so the particular iterations of those injuries. What else? Ethos, ethos practice. That's a very big question. That how do you put the particular ethos into practice? I think we can have a long debate on that one. I personally am not a big believer that you can, but it's a deep legal theory debate. That's probably it's not. And I'm happy to discuss with anyone who's interested. And again, if I'm destroying any accomplishments, and to put ethos into practice, maybe I was not clear. So basically, of course, ethos is very important, right? But there are many ways of putting it into practice, right? And my own problem in the European debate was that it's always the ethos from the perspective of the center. You see what I mean? So once this ethos gets interpreted, when this gets down to earth, there's always one particular interpretation of this ethos, and that's my problem. And it's always one narrative, and that what bothered me, and that's why I had to reconstruct this to articulate it in an analytically sound way, I hope. If I'm destroying any accomplishments, I truly don't think so, But that was, again, the debate I had in the parliament. So basically the French came back and said, wow, the social, this is so important. I said, of course it's important, but don't tell me that, the workers who will not be able to come to the center anymore because of the change posted workers directive. So basically post-Laval liking, new legislation is very harmful to the periphery. I mean, that's quite clear, although no one's really written much about it. It's huge backlash, and it's always this reproduction of hierarchy. Even there's a win for the periphery, poof, something will come back, right? It's like a big snowball, right? So, and I don't think I'm destroying anything along the way. I'm all for the ethos of the social. I'm all for the constitutional accomplishments of the union. We can be so proud of them, right? But let's reshape this debate, which sort of, as I said, arrests our social imagination. Let's put the injuries on the table. Let's articulate them. There's a lot of work to be done, obviously, but I think that's the way to go, for rethinking the. Okay.